Hey everybody. So last episode we talked about Blockbuster's abandoned block party buildings, their near imperceptible span of existence in the midst of a fast-moving decade before being eroded and stripped down to burnt-out labyrinthian husks by the tireless currents of time. Between their abandonment and their destruction/reoccupation, the block party structures could be explored as incidental mazes by those bold enough to venture inside. Now, if, understandably, you want the maze experience without the rotting building elements, you've still got plenty of options, and at the top of my mind presently is the seminal 1982 Atari 2600 title Entombed, which tasks the player with navigating a fast-scrolling warren of corners and crevices whilst being pursued by a little blue entity. Most relevant to the video, however, is the fact that for over 3 decades, nobody could figure out how the game actually worked. So, let's take a crack at it. Where else to start but the beginning? In this case, the vibrant autumn of 1982. Around November of this year, now defunct and wonderfully named publisher US Games releases Entombed for the wildly popular Atari 2600 system. The game is simple. It kind of has to be, and it centers around a scrolling maze which the player must pathfind through while dodging what is ostensibly a zombie. You can pick up an appropriately rectangular item called a make-break to either remove or place a chunk of maze wall to aid you in this endeavor. If you get knocked off the screen, you die. If the zombie touches you, you die. Simple, quick, repeatable. It's a 2600 game. And it remained as such throughout the crash of '83, throughout the rise of the NES, and through the various sundry events leading up to and following the turn of the millennium. In fact, it wasn't until 2018 that someone noticed something was a bit off. The maze in Entombed is impossible, or at least it seemed as such. It continues to appear for minutes at a time, with patterns that are generally navigable, as if designed beforehand. But the game cartridges themselves were limited to 4 kilobytes of ROM in those early days, making it infeasible, if not outright impossible, for the programmer of Entombed to have stored entire maze layouts statically, or to have such layouts residing in memory. Thus, it had to be generated procedurally, but that didn't quite seem right either. It wasn't purely random. The mazes almost always yielded valid paths, regardless of how long they went on for, and while a more modern system could easily evaluate the solvability of a maze in real time, such a feat was a bit outside the console's capabilities. The 2600 was, to put it diplomatically, anemic, even for its own time. Its budget MOS 6507 microprocessor limited its address space to 8 kilobytes, and programmers had to make do with a whopping 128 bytes of RAM on a weird agglomerate integrated circuit called a riot chip. Not small enough to be stored, not quick enough to be built. An impossible, inexplicable maze algorithm, and one that for a long time remained a mystery. That was until 2018, when researchers John Aycock and Tara Copplestone set out to disassemble the bytecode of Entombed to find out what exactly made it tick. And they found it. Sorta. After the laborious effort of reconstructing the game's source code, Aycock and Copplestone were able to deduce that, baked into the circuits of the Entombed cartridge, there was in fact a procedural maze generation algorithm. But why it worked wasn't quite so clear. Let me explain. Entombed generated squares of the maze in rows, from top to bottom, and in each row left to right, like reading a book. To determine whether or not any given square would contain a space or a wall, the algorithm took 5 variables in the form of the 5 squares surrounding the square being generated. 2 to the left, 1 to the left, top middle, and top right. Since we're dealing with squares that can be either a space or a wall, we have essentially 5 binary digits. An unsigned 5-bit number, or a sample space of 32 possible wall configurations. After reading these digits, Entombed used them to query a lookup table on the cartridge, and this is the weird part. The table seemingly arbitrarily had 32 entries, one for each possible wall configuration, and based on the entries the game would place a wall, a space, or randomly select between the two, then move on to the next square. If we call the 5 input squares A through E in order, then input space space wall would produce a space, wall space space wall space would produce a wall, and wall space space would produce a random choice between the two, and so on like this for 29 more times. There was a case like this for every one of the 32 possible arrangements, and that's basically it. That's the algorithm. Now, this answers some questions and poses a couple more. It solves the problem of how the maze fits on the Entombed cartridge, and how it's able to be made so quickly. Since the game's only checking 5 squares at a time, it can generate the maze at the breakneck pace seen in-game. But the algorithm doesn't know anything about the maze. All it knows is the 5 squares surrounding its present index, and yet it's somehow able to procedurally create a consistently runnable maze each and every time. That'd be like only being able to see in a 2-foot circle around you and still being able to construct a 3-bedroom house at a normal pace. The table works, the algorithm works, the game works, but why? Aycock and Cobblestone left this, for the time being, as an open question. But in time, contact was made with the only individual potentially able to answer it, the game's original programmer. As it would turn out, a man named Stephen Sidley was responsible for the game's creation in 1982. Aycock was able to make contact with Sidley and inquired as to the provenance of the algorithm, as well as how its seemingly miraculous table operated. But Sidley's response was not as expected. He had not written the algorithm. While working for US Games, the programmer had apparently been given a cartridge containing a mysterious maze generator algorithm by the company, and told to repurpose it into a functional game. Sidley then designed the game without fully understanding the algorithm either, simply using it to generate new rows and constructing a game around it. Steve Sidley programmed Entombed, but the algorithm predated it. When asked about the origins of the algorithm, Sidley was less helpful. He responded with a legend, that it had been written by, quote, a stoner who had developed it while blackout drunk and had no more understanding of its operation than anyone else. However, in closing, he did provide something slightly more useful, a name, Newell. Aycock was able to use this lead to unearth a 2008 interview by Digit Press with a computer scientist named Paul Allen Newell, in which he explains his experiences in the early 1980s creating a very familiar maze generation algorithm. After this article was discovered, and later following a New Yorker interview with Aycock, Sidley, and Newell in 2021, the story began to slowly piece itself together. You see, in 1981, Newell, a computer scientist working for Western Technologies, got it into his head to develop a game based upon navigating a dynamically generated maze. In collaboration with a mathematician friend named Duncan Muirhead, the pair developed a rough outline for an elegant algorithm to do exactly this over a few beers on a night out. Not quite the drunken stupor Sidley had described the session as, but hey, that's just how legends work. Newell had originally embarked on the creation of the algorithm during the development of a game called Towering Inferno, but had largely relegated it to a side project called Maz V by the spring of 1982. By the summer, while still working as a contractor, Newell's management had taken an interest in the maze program and requested that it be developed into a full-fledged game. As such, Newell handed over a stripped-down version of the algorithm called Minotaur 7 to a young programmer named Stephen Sidley, who constructed around it the game that would eventually become Entombed by the end of that year. And so the story concluded. A programmer and a mathematician write a hobbyist maze generator algorithm. An algorithm gets handed to a new programmer with little explanation. A programmer builds a working game around an algorithm, and the game goes unexplained for the next 35 years. In 2022, Aycock published a follow-up paper explaining how the drunken programmer story likely came about, that it was a way to defer intellectual property responsibility for ownership of the program, and in the paper gave it an official name, the Muirhead-Newell Endless Maze algorithm, reportedly named as such because Newell believed Muirhead's math had been 51% of the total work. Now, we're not quite done. We know where the algorithm came from, who wrote it, and how it ended up in Entombed, but we still don't know why it works. What's the deal with the table? How do the mazes come out the way they do when only a tiny chunk of the maze is visible to the algorithm? In 2021, two researchers at PSL in Paris named Leon Machler and David Nakash posited that the table was tuned by its original programmer so that every choice conformed to a set of 3 rules. That 2x2 squares of wall or space weren't allowed, that any vertical chunk of wall or space couldn't start with width 1, and that any path in a line must connect to a path in the next line. When, based on the 5 input squares, a wall would violate any of these rules, a space is hard-coded to appear. Vice versa for walls, and when neither would violate a rule, a choice is randomly made. By this interpretation, Newell and Muirhead would have started with guidelines that ensure any given maze is solvable, then built a table of 32 entries where every entry is tuned to make sure it never breaks a rule, then finally written the algorithm to take input and place a square based on the table's output. But as it would turn out, all this wasn't necessary. For the 2022 paper, Aycock was able to obtain Newell's original notes for the algorithm and determine the exact steps the program took to determine a square's status. And, well, okay, this isn't a technical show, at least I don't try to make it one, so suffice to say the algorithm split the 5-square piece into 3 separate pieces and did some math with the first 2 pieces to determine what a square should be, with a special overriding case being selected if the 3rd piece was uniform, and 2 even more special cases being selected for specific arrangements that Newell noticed made unpleasant mazes in testing. So at the end of the day, the table was mostly an intermediary step and wasn't really the mystically effective codex that it was originally assumed to be, but I digress. It's kind of weird to know that it is indeed possible to write a piece of code so inexplicable that it becomes the subject of academic study years later. It makes me kind of paranoid, but that's just me. So ends the mystery of the Entombed maze algorithm, which, if you look at it a certain way, was never really a mystery at all. It just took a while to find the guy who had all the answers and was ready to give them. It makes you wonder. But anyway, that's all I got for tonight. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you around.